WVCY America presents Crosstalk, a nationwide call-in program discussing issues that have an effect on our families, our communities, our churches, our nation, and our world. Crosstalk, an opportunity for you to voice your concerns for biblical principles. And now live by satellite and around the world on the internet at vcyamerica.org. Here is today's Crosstalk.
Well, thank you for joining us on Crosstalk here on VCY America. Ladies and gentlemen, this past Saturday, the breaking news alerts were going off in rapid fashion, indicating that the U.S. military forces descended upon, as well as President Trump described it, a heavily fortified military fortress in the heart of Caracas to capture Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores. They were flown out by helicopter to a U.S. warship, later flown to the United States. General Caine, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said U.S. forces had rehearsed over and over again these procedures that they would be followed. President Trump said they actually built a house which was identical to the one that they went into with all the same, rooms and the outlay, the steel in place. The U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi said that they have indicted Nicolas Maduro and his wife in the Southern District of New York, being charged with Narco-Terrorism Conspiracy, Cocaine Importation Conspiracy, possession of machine guns and destructive devices, and conspiracy to possess machine guns and destructive devices against the United States. She said they will soon face the full wrath of American justice on American soil in American courts. Well, this morning, Nicolas Maduro pled not guilty during his arraignment in federal court. The question is, who exactly is Nicolas Maduro? What are the implications of this precision-guided operation? And what do we need to know about what's happening in Central America and the South America as a result of all of this? It's our privilege to have with us somebody who is really in the know on this topic, Alex Newman. He is an award-winning international freelance journalist. He's an author and researcher, an educator, and a consultant, senior editor for The New American. He's authored several books. You hear him also on Behind the Deep State that airs on WVCY Television and VCY.TV. Alex, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's an honor and a privilege to be here. Thank you, Jim.
So, Alex, this is an area of the world that you really have specialized in. You've done much research, and so I'm going to have you just share with our listeners your background to this region, and then all of coupled with this, we want to know who is Nicolas Maduro? How did he ascend into the presidency of Venezuela? So, unleash for us this region and what's happened to this nation that was once a U.S. friendly nation.
Well, thank you again, Jim. And Latin America has always been near and dear to my heart. I actually moved down there when I was 4. I spent almost all my childhood in Latin America before moving to Europe and Africa. So I've lived in Latin America longer than anywhere else in the world. And I've been covering Latin America and really the communist takeover of Latin America my entire career in journalism. One of the first big investigative pieces that I did for the New American magazine was called Resurgent Communism in Latin America, and it was about what analysts then were starting to call the pink tide. And they wanted people to think that it was just, liberals and regular lefties just kind of winning elections, and wow, isn't this great? Latin America is going to be more progressive and whatnot. And as I dug deeper, I realized that no, this was a much bigger story. What we were watching was the communist takeover of the region. I actually designated it the red tsunami rather than the pink tide. And what I found was that it goes back to 1990. There was a very important meeting that happened in Sao Paulo, which is a city I lived in for 4 years, in the year 1990. And this was between Fidel Castro, the mass-murdering dictator of Cuba at that time, who, of course, was installed with help from the U.S. government, Luis Ignacio Lula da Silva, who at the time was just a relatively insignificant community organizer, very much like Barack Obama before his political career, and the FARC in Colombia, which is a Marxist narco-terrorist group that's been murdering civilians and trying to take over Colombia for 50 years. They finally have succeeded now with help from Obama, the Sandinistas and others. And at this meeting, they agreed to create what they called the Foro de Sao Paulo, or in Portuguese, the San Pablo, El Foro de San Pablo in Spanish, or in English it would be the Sao Paulo Forum. And they kind of framed it publicly as just a discussion group to have solidarity among different left-wing movements and political parties in Latin America. But from the very beginning, it was backed by the Kremlin. From the very beginning, it was backed by communists around the world, including the Chinese Communist Party. And from the beginning, it was backed by powerful forces in the United States, the forces that some people, including myself, refer to as the deep state. And the idea was, hey, these armed revolutions, these liberation guerrillas don't seem to be making a lot of progress in taking over countries anymore. We've got to try a new tactic. And so the new tactic is going to be, we're going to try to win electorally by any means possible. And so what they did was they were using drug money from organizations like the FARC. They were using any kind of illegal money they could get their hands on. Luis Inácio Lula da Silva, one of the founders of this group, would end up being tried, convicted, and imprisoned for his role in a scandal in Brazil where they were looting Odebrecht, a company, and also the Petrobras, the state-owned oil company, to funnel that money not just into their own pockets, but also into the campaigns of leftists and communists around Latin America. But anyways, 1997, they in their minutes, they had a meeting, and they said the purpose of this organization, this vehicle, was to reclaim in Latin America what had been lost in Eastern Europe, namely communist tyranny, communist slavery. And so they have been hard at work. They've been very, very successful. They've got big support from Europe. They've got big support from Moscow, from Beijing. And until very recently, they had major support from the U.S. government, and they were very successful in that they took over almost every country in Latin America. If they didn't outright control the government, they were the top opposition party. And now they're on defense, thanks to the efforts of the Trump administration.
Right.
But this is far from over.
It is far from over, and we are seeing a transformation taking place in different Latin American countries. But with our focus right now on Venezuela, help us understand Nicolas Maduro and his ascendancy to the presidency of Venezuela.
So Venezuela was a major prize for this Latin American communist network, and the reason why is it was so lucrative. Prior to being taken over by Hugo Chavez, who was the predecessor to Nicolas Maduro, Venezuela was a very, very wealthy and prosperous, by Latin American standards, country. It had relatively free markets. It had something closely approximating a middle class. I mean, not quite like the United States, but it was moving in that direction. And then the Cubans, along with this broader network, the Sao Paulo Forum, decided they needed to capture Venezuela for themselves because it had all this oil wealth. Mm-hmm. It was very strategically located for drug trafficking purposes. And I think the best way to understand the takeover of Venezuela by Hugo Chavez is it became a colony of Cuba in the most real sense, right? Hugo Chavez was the hand-picked puppet of the Castro regime. And once they had control of Venezuela, they started doing several things. One is they started creating election programs, election software and hardware systems that they were intending to use to steal elections around the world. Another is they nationalized the oil assets and started putting all that oil money at the disposal of the revolution. So all over Latin America, communist, leftist, guerrillas were being financed with oil money from Venezuela. And then, of course, the drug trafficking, which was a huge component. Venezuela, and I've been talking about this for years, and nobody was paying attention. Venezuela is the home of the Cartel de los Soles, and this is all now in the indictment against Maduro. This is one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful, cartels in the world. We're talking potentially hundreds of billions of dollars. And it's very difficult to tell where the Venezuelan government begins and the cartel ends, right? There's a very blurry line there. The government of the United States is now arguing that Maduro was basically the head of the cartel, and I think that's an accurate characterization. And they were using a sovereign state to engage in all these criminal activities. They figured, hey, we have a sovereign state. They can't search us. They can't stop us. They can't arrest us. They can't do anything. They're flying drugs around the world on military planes. And so Maduro was basically the hand-picked successor of Hugo Chavez. And he continued the Chavez legacy of trying to export revolution around the world. And by the way, it's not just the communists there, right? Maduro and Chavez before him, they invited in the Iranians and Hezbollah and Hamas. I mean, every nasty character you can think of somehow has a nexus with Venezuela. So it's a very, very important country. And I would argue it's a major threat to the United States. People don't realize a lot of the subversive activity that we have in the United States also has ties to Venezuela. I'll never forget when one of the co-founders of the Black Lives Matter movement posted a picture of herself on Twitter with the murderous dictator Nicolas Maduro and said, oh, it's so nice to be in a country where they have intelligent political discourse. Why are subversive revolutionaries in our country working with a mass-murdering communist dictator? I think the U.S. government ought to be trying to find out.
Indeed. And, we can often tell, we learn a lot about individuals by the friendships that they keep. And so I heard you mention a number of nations. There are a number of countries that really represent the friendship of Venezuela. I mean, are they not heart soulmates of countries like China, like Iran?
Oh, there's no question. This is part of an international alliance, and Venezuela is just so strategically important to this. But the Communist Chinese are involved, the Russians are involved, the Iranians are involved, and even here in the United States, this is what people don't understand. They think that this is something happening in Latin America that has no nexus to the United States. If you look at what I call the deep state in the United States, they've been aiding and abetting this, including in Venezuela, all along. The Council on Foreign Relations, what I call deep state headquarters here in the U.S., until pretty recently, their director of their Latin American programs was a lady called Cilia Flores. Now, Cilia Flores has been identified by our own Defense Intelligence Agency analysts, military intelligence, as an agent of influence for the Cuban dictatorship. Why would the Council on Foreign Relations, these are the most powerful people in our country, CEOs, politicians, Supreme Court justices, you name it, why do they have a lady who at the very least is very sympathetic to Latin American communism running their programs? Inquiring minds would like to know. So now Venezuela is critically important, and unfortunately Barack Obama really helped this process, so did George Soros. If we have time before the break, I'll kind of give a little bit of the historical background here that people probably don't know, Jim. Do we have about a minute?
Yeah, we got a minute 45.
Okay. So, back in the 1960s and 70s, some of the older listeners may remember the bombing campaign we had in this country perpetrated by the Weather Underground. They bombed the State Department, they bombed the Capitol building, they bombed the Pentagon, they murdered police officers and then bombed their funerals, a very nasty bunch. And this was a terrorist group founded by Bill Ayers. It was working with DGI, the Communist Cuban Intelligence, to pick targets and to get its money. And they had a plan, we know from the FBI operative who infiltrated the organization, to kick off a revolution in this country, invite in the Soviet Union, Communist China, Vietnam, North Korea, Cuba, etc., to occupy parts of it. And then their next part of their plan, and Larry Grathwohl, the FBI operative who uncovered it all, explained this to the public. They were planning on operating a network of concentration camps where they expected to exterminate 25 million counter-revolutionary Americans after they were successful in their revolution. Well, that plan didn't work, as we know. Bill Ayers ended up being arrested. He got off on a technicality and became a professor of education. But he later launched the political career of Barack Obama in his living room. So there's a long historical background here that people need to know of.
Alex Newman with us here today. We're taking a look at the unfolding this weekend of the capture of Venezuela's president. And we will also, in our next segment, learn a little bit about his wife as well, Cilia Flores, and about this precision-style maneuvering of extracting Maduro from Venezuela. And now the implications, not only in Latin America, but really the world, and the implications of this maneuver as it relates to other nations across this planet. We'll be back in just 1 minute. Alex Newman, our guest today, and he is from The New American, senior editor there, thenewamerican.com, and also is the leader of libertysentinel.org. We'll be back in just 1 minute. This is Crosstalk on VCY America.
Back to Genesis with Dr. John Morris, creation author with the Institute for Creation Research. Dr. Morris, was Genesis written as poetry?
No, it wasn't, Chris, but this has been a favorite claim of liberals, subtly indicating that Genesis was a work of art and not meant to be taken as literal history. But this has been shown to be false. At the Institute for Creation Research, we've investigated this claim. It was found by statistical analysis of the verb tenses used in the Genesis account of creation that it's about the least poetic passage in all the Old Testament. It was written as sober narrative history and was meant to be understood by its readers as history. Of course, even if it were poetry, it doesn't mean it's not to be believed. Who says God can't write with flair? But he wrote Genesis as a sober historical account, and we need to believe it as such. Let's go back to Genesis and get it right.
For more on the foundational principles set forth in Genesis, visit us on the web at www.icr.org.
This is Crosstalk on VCY America, an amazing operation this past weekend, extracting, apprehending, capturing the president of Venezuela, bringing back to U.S. soil and indicted. Alex Newman with us today. He is the founder and CEO of Liberty Sentinel and also senior editor for The New American. And talking about the unfolding of events, Alex lived a good portion of his life in this region. He has studied this region and really the turning over of this region to communism. And Alex, as we're talking a lot, people have heard the name of Nicolas Maduro, but perhaps not his wife, Cilia Flores. What do we know about her? That was a new name to a lot of people.
Yeah, well, she seems to be a key figure here as well. She was indicted by a grand jury in New York, a federal grand jury, and she seems to have been an active co-conspirator in this. And we see the same thing, actually, with the vice president and her husband, the Rodriguez couple. There are well-informed sources who have told me that they actually think that the vice president and her husband, who previously served as vice president, were actually the real brains behind this whole operation. Mm-hmm. So you seem to have these husband and wife teams, both with Maduro and his wife, and also with the vice president, who for whatever reason was left in place and is now at least ostensibly running the government there. Very, very interesting situation that you have here.
So let's talk also about the scenario unfolding of this. I mean, it's just amazing the precision that they went into this military compound, basically, and took Maduro and his wife. Not one American life was lost in this process here, and the planning, the preparation, the master design of this was amazing.
It really was, and I think it's perfectly legitimate and reasonable to have disagreements about the policy. Was this a good idea? Was it a bad idea? Mm-hmm. I don't claim to know, but one thing that we can all agree on is that the U.S. military and the law enforcement operatives who were involved in this did an absolutely amazing job of executing this. It's very, very hard to fathom the amount of planning, the amount of skill that went into this. And if nothing else, all those people involved deserve to be commended for their professionalism in carrying out this mission that was given to them by the president. It was just simply stunning, almost unprecedented. I don't know of anything like that ever happening really in the history of the world. Mm-hmm. And it was, I would imagine that there's a lot of dictators and bad guys around the world tonight who are not sleeping very comfortably.
Yeah. And one of the major questions that came through the talk shows over the weekend is by what authority? By what authority did President Trump have to go in and do what he did?
Yeah, and that's a very interesting question. They seem to be giving several different lines of reasoning here. The first one, obviously, is that this was a law enforcement operation. And I actually made a similar argument in a major interview I did several months ago. We did this in October on USA Watchdog. And what I said is you can't really think of Maduro as, a normal president of a normal country. The guy is a gang leader. He's a criminal operative who stole an election and is now masquerading as the legitimate government leader. And the Trump administration has made that case that he's not a legitimate president. He's not the head of a sovereign government. He's a criminal who stole an election and has been indicted by the American judicial system. But we have a Constitution, and our Constitution gives the war power very clearly, by the way. There's no ambiguity in this. The war power is given very clearly to the U.S. Congress, not to the President. Now, when Congress declares war, the President is, of course, the commander-in-chief of our armed forces. But Congress has not declared war on Venezuela. And so I think that's why they're calling this a law enforcement operation rather than a military operation or a war. And I'm sure this is going to be debated in court. There's a lot of people in Congress right now who are upset that they were not consulted. We do have whistleblowers coming out of Venezuela, including the former head of military intelligence. He goes by the name of El Pollo, saying publicly now that the U.S. Congress contains many people who are allies, friends, and even on the payroll of Nicolas Maduro. And so, Trump could make the argument that if he were to tell Congress what he was planning, that would have been leaked to Maduro, and the plan would have failed. So there's a lot of open questions here. Again, unprecedented. We did see Thomas Jefferson, even before getting congressional approval, send some warships to deal with the Barbary states that were attacking American shipping. And so I imagine Trump will probably bring that up if the questions persist. But very, very interesting from a legal perspective, and I think it's still something of an open question.
Yeah, and Secretary of State Marco Rubio, too, he was asked about this, this war against Venezuela. He said, no, this is not a war against Venezuela. This was, it's the apprehension of a narco-terrorist here. And I think what's important to point out as well that was it just about a year ago, it was Joe Biden, when he was president, that put out a $25 million bounty on Maduro. And you've got, so he's put this bounty out for him. And now we have Kamala Harris saying Donald Trump's actions in Venezuela do not make America safer, stronger, or more affordable. She said that the American people do not want this. They are tired of being lied to, that Maduro is a brutal, illegitimate dictator does not change the fact that this action was unlawful and unwise. We also have Pete Buttigieg, who spoke out in opposition to this, saying it's an old and obvious pattern, an unpopular president failing on the economy and losing his grip on power at home decides to launch a war for regime change abroad. The American people don't want to run a foreign country while our leaders fail to improve their life. And yet just a year or so ago, he was praising Biden for putting out this price on the head of Maduro.
Yeah, and I think the Democrats have several things going on here, and one is that they have been very, very friendly and supportive of this Latin American communist network, and so they're kind of in an awkward position. I think some of the criticisms that they're making, and there are some Republicans making these arguments as well, are valid. We have a Constitution that needs to be respected, and if there are concerns about the constitutionality of a particular action, those ought to be discussed and debated. A law enforcement investigation, an indictment, these are certainly legitimate tools of the government. The government's job, as the Bible tells us, is to punish evil, and I don't think anybody denies that Maduro was engaged in massive evil. But typically, when we have a fugitive from American justice in another country, the procedure for bringing him to justice is to request an extradition, right? We don't normally send troops into a foreign country to just grab people off the streets without the consent of that government. Now, that wasn't possible in Venezuela for obvious reasons. So I think this really opens up a whole new world of legal questions. And there are some conservative European leaders who've raised the question, well, what does this mean for the future? Does this mean that the sovereignty of a nation state is over? I mean, can governments now go into other countries to kidnap or arrest leaders that they don't like? And so even some conservative European leaders have raised concerns about this, and I think those are concerns that deserve to be heard. I don't know what the answer to these questions is, but it certainly is a valid question, and it opens up a lot of legal questions that I think legal scholars will be debating and discussing for many, many years to come. President
Trump says that the U.S. is going to run Venezuela, and there's a lot of questions about what that really means as well on running Venezuela. He's not talking about having us run it politically, I don't believe.
Yeah, and that's another question. What does that even mean? I don't think anybody knows right now. We don't want Venezuela to descend into anarchy, and at this point, because the United States government was so involved in creating this situation, the U.S. government now bears some responsibility. Now, in reality, the U.S. government is not even supposed to be running the United States. So the job of the government is to punish evil and to obey the Constitution, which gives the government a few limited powers. It's not meant to run the United States, and it's certainly not meant to run Venezuela, right? The Founding Fathers said the purpose of the government was to protect rights. And so even some very close allies, people who I know personally, like General Michael Flynn, who served as a national security advisor, have raised concerns about what this means. The U.S. government is $200 trillion in unfunded liabilities, $40 trillion in debt. We cannot afford to run another country right now, even if we wanted to, even if it was a good idea. So I think the Trump administration is going to have to issue some clarity here in the days ahead so that these questions are resolved.
And he's talking about the oil aspect as well. Now, it appears that Venezuela, those rich in oil as they are, that they have been running far below capacity in Venezuela. And President Trump has talked about, harvesting, really, getting things working again, dealing with the infrastructure, the oil. And that really begs another question in all of this, too, because China is concerned. China's been a purchaser of oil from Iran, and yet President Trump is giving assurance to communist China, you're still going to get your oil from Venezuela. And that's kind of concerning, too.
It is. Yeah, it's a bit counterintuitive. And, the situation in Venezuela with oil is interesting. I know there are a lot of people now arguing that this whole thing was about oil. I strongly disagree. The United States has more oil than we'll ever know what to do with. The reason we haven't been able to access it is because the government has blocked access under the guise of protecting a nature thing or stopping harm to a lizard or an ecosystem. So we have plenty of oil here. We certainly don't need to invade foreign countries to have oil supplies. But it is true that American energy companies really did use American money, investor dollars, to develop this. And this is true all over the world, right? The Arabs didn't know what to do with the oil. They had to call in American companies, American engineers to come in and help them get that out and develop the infrastructure for processing it, refining it, and shipping it to overseas markets. And what Chavez did and what later Maduro perpetuated was basically a giant theft, right? I mean, they call it nationalization, and they have fancy terms to conceal what they're doing, but ultimately it's theft. And it's not a theft from an abstract, big evil oil company. This is theft from regular everyday investors, me and you, our retirement accounts that are invested in oil companies. So thievery is wrong, but of course that was a risk, and all the companies understood the risk when they went in and developed these resources in countries like this. They always know that nationalization is a possible threat, and that's priced into their calculations. Is it the job of the U.S. government to go protect the assets of oil companies and investors overseas? And I would argue no, the Constitution does not authorize that. But I certainly don't think this was a war for oil, which is an argument many are making.
Right.
But it will be good, I think, for the world to get more oil capacity back online, so that may be another silver lining in this whole mess.
And President Trump indicating that the proceeds then from this expanded, capture of oil is going to, offset the expenses of the infrastructure, paying the U.S. back, et cetera. Venezuela's vice president, I understand she took off to Russia?
Yes, that's my understanding as well. And in fact, the Chi-Coms, the senior leader of the Chinese Communist Party, was meeting with Maduro just shortly before this whole operation took place. And that goes to what we were saying. There are very deep ties between the Kremlin and Beijing to this regime. But I think the vice president is right to be very concerned. I think she is just as much a part of this criminal network that Trump has described as Maduro was. It's interesting that she was left in charge. I saw one of her speeches earlier today arguing that this was some kind of Zionist plot against Venezuela. And she said that they were trying to enslave the Venezuelans. I mean, it's hard to imagine how they could be more enslaved than they were under Maduro. But it's going to be, and I think this is one of the big problems with this, is we don't have clarity about where this is going.
Right.
And, of course, nature abhors a vacuum. When you have a situation like this, it often ends in chaos, and chaos is a recipe for bringing in, either civil war or more tyranny. Yes, the Venezuelan expatriate community, the diaspora, is very pleased that Maduro is gone. But there needs to be some clarity and some guidance on what's happening here before this situation festers much longer.
Alex Newman is our guest here today on Crosstalk, and friends, you can find his writings, his coverage of so many issues at thenewamerican.com, thenewamerican.com, and also libertysentinel.org. We're going to take a look at some other aspects right after the break. I also have a time for you to call in a little bit later in the program, too. But what about these protests breaking out in the United States and also Colombia? Has Colombia been a bed partner with Venezuela in its manufacturing and distribution of drugs? Back in a minute here on Crosstalk.
As we strive to be like Christ, there are besetting sins which take us off course. Sinful anger is one of them. Anger is a willful and deliberate choice, often caused by not being able to attain our prideful or selfish goals. If not dealt with, anger will turn into something worse. Another besetting sin is that of anxiety and fear. Ungodly anxiety goes beyond reasonable concern and involves worry about mere possibilities. And then there's the ungodly fear. Fear that often paralyzes and causes us to focus on our circumstances rather than on God and His promises. There is hope. In the booklet, Anger, Anxiety, and Fear, author Stuart Scott provides a biblical perspective on these issues, providing the path to victory. Anger, Anxiety, and Fear. Available for a donation of $9 or 3 copies for $24. Call VCY 1-800-729-9829.
You're listening to Crosstalk on VCY America. With us today, Alex Newman, an award-winning international freelance journalist. Alex has extensive knowledge of Latin America, lived there for a number of years, has been following really the communization of the area and the implications that have happened to so many different nations. And with that, Alex, Colombia, a neighbor of Venezuela, have they been in bed together as far as the drug industry is concerned?
There's no question about it, and this is another story that I've covered in great depth. Going back almost a decade ago now, I was reporting on the communist terrorist takeover of Colombia. This did not need to happen. Right? Colombia, for 50 years, was resisting this trend toward communism, and they paid a heavy price for this. You had the FARC, which we talked about earlier, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, basically a Soviet and Cuban front group, terrorist organization that was slaughtering civilians, bombing civilian infrastructure, kidnapping children, using them as sex slaves and soldiers. A horrific group, funding its activities also through cocaine trafficking to the United States. And for 50 years, they were on defense. They were having to hide in the jungles and just carry out terrorist attacks. And then, thanks to Barack Obama and George Soros and the Castro regime, the FARC was brought in from the cold. They were given seats in the parliament as part of this so-called peace deal. And basically, Barack Obama handed Colombia over to the communists on a silver platter. And their current leader, Gustavo Petro, Trump just had some very choice words about him. He said on Air Force One that a very sick man was running Colombia who traffics drugs and all the rest of it. I want people to realize there's so much background here that the media has deliberately hidden from us. Okay, in September of last year, so this was just a few months ago, Gustavo Petro, the president of Colombia, was on American soil in New York with a bullhorn shouting about how American soldiers, American troops, should disobey the president, should disobey their commander-in-chief, and, quote-unquote, stand with humanity. What is that even supposed to mean? And why is a foreign leader coming to our soil and urging our soldiers to basically commit sedition and defy lawful orders? This was before the Democrat congressman said that. So this is a very serious problem. Colombia has quite literally been taken over by the communists, and it is now firmly under the grip of this Latin American Communist Network that we started off the show with, the Sao Paulo Forum. And Trump has his eye on them, and I think for good reason.
As it relates to, and actually, I'm sure he is taking note of the apprehension of Maduro and wondering, could I be next? As I'm sure that there are other so-called, dictators that are having to watch their backs as well.
Yeah, there's no question about it, and I guarantee you, in Havana and in Bogota and in Brasilia and in countries, in capitals across the world, there are some really nasty people wondering about whether they're going to be next. And, Trump has even suggested that they're looking at that possibility. Now, whether that's a good idea or a bad idea, that's a whole other discussion.
Right.
The fact that Trump is openly considering this is documented. He was just on Air Force One telling reporters, we're thinking Cuba is going to be the next one to fall now that they don't have Venezuelan money. We're looking at the sick guy who runs Colombia he actually publicly said he wasn't opposed to taking on the Colombians. So it seems like the Trump administration has taken a major interest in the communist movement in Latin America. And if you read their national security strategy, they seem to be pivoting away from kind of the 20th century, at least the second half of the 20th century, where the U.S. was kind of the hegemonic global power that kind of oversaw the whole world, to now retreating back to just the Monroe Doctrine. Donald Trump calls it the Donroe Doctrine, where we're just going to primarily focus on the Western Hemisphere and let the Communist Chinese have East Asia and the Russians kind of dominate Eurasia. So again, whether that's a wise policy or not, that's a whole other subject, but I'm sure that there are a lot of people, especially in Latin American capitals, who are wondering what this means for their future.
Alex and friends, by the way, if you'd like to get online with us today, our phone number to Crosstalk, 800-733-9829 with your questions or brief comments, 1-800-733-9829. What have you observed as far as reaction from around the world, and as well as the protests? We saw right away the Times Square filled with activists with it seemed pre-printed signs already to denounce the Trump administration, what's going on. But we must also note that not long after that Venezuelans who are here in the U.S. who have been very much opposed to the Maduro administration, they were out there in jubilation and celebrating about the downfall in the apprehension there of Maduro.
That's right, Jim, and that is undeniable. Right? We've got 12 million Venezuelans who have had to flee that country as a result of the socialism and the tyranny of Hugo Chavez and then Nicolas Maduro. A huge community of Venezuelans in Miami, and of course the Cubans in Miami stand in solidarity. And they were just rejoicing in the streets, thanking Donald Trump for finally liberating their country. And this was true around the world with the Venezuelan diaspora. In Venezuela, the feelings are more mixed. There are people who are just, crying tears of joy now that Maduro is removed from power. These are people who have suffered horrific abuses, people whose family members and friends have been kidnapped and tortured by the regime for disagreeing. And so there is really very real jubilation. But, of course, there are also people who benefited from the regime, who are connected to the regime, or even just who don't approve of a foreign country getting involved in their politics, who are not as pleased. But, there are a lot of people who are very, very happy about this, people who have been directly impacted by this. And I'll tell you, as somebody who was born in Miami, and Miami is as close of a thing to home as I have, the sentiment in Miami could not be more joyous at this moment.
Isn't this a similar procedure that was used to catch Noriega, as kind of a snatch and grab?
Yes, that's true. Yep, there have been things like this in the past, and again, where law enforcement was brought to bear rather than kind of a war operation. Mm-hmm. So, we'll see where this goes. But I think a lot of people are very, very pleased for good reason. And, the people who are upset, especially here in America, I think, we need to have a big discussion about this. Unfortunately, our nation has moved more and more in the direction of communism. If you look at the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto, many of them have been implemented. We've got subversive movements here that are actually connected to Venezuela, operating in our cities. I mentioned Black Lives Matter, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. A lot of these gangsters here. And I also mentioned that the deep state in the United States, including very much George Soros and some of his fellow operatives, they have been promoting this socialist and communist takeover of Latin America. And, of course, they're the ones who are funding a lot of the protests in this country, whether it's the pro-Hamas protests, whether it's the pro-Maduro protests. You got to follow the money. And what you'll find is that this is much, much bigger than what we're being told in the media.
Our phone number to Crosstalk, 800-733-9829. Jim is our first caller. Hi, Jim. You're on the air.
Hello, gentlemen. First of all, I would like to know, I just read a very lengthy report this morning, and I haven't heard anybody else talk about this, that Russia and China took all the silver out of Venezuela and took it back to their countries. Anybody hear about this report?
Familiar?
And speaking of Soros and Mom Donnie and these guys, I think they need to be in court as well and be, especially Soros, what he's done. And Mom Donnie, he's heading the same direction as Maduro, and it's like, why is he even allowed to be in our governing in our country? But anyway, I want to know about the silver. Anybody heard about that at all?
Alex, any awareness of that?
I have not heard about that, but I think there's something major happening in the silver market that we see, and it does involve Russia and China and the United States. For those who don't follow these things, the price of silver has skyrocketed, even just in the last few weeks. It's exploded. Over the last year, it's gone up over 125%. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but I think there may well be something going on in the global monetary system. And so I have not heard those specific reports about the silver being removed from Venezuela, but something big is happening in silver, and I think it's directly related to the geopolitical situation that we're seeing around the world.
Jim, thanks for the call. And I find it he brought up Maduro. He brought up the new Mayor Mandami of New York City, and very interesting. He tweeted out, right away, or put on X his condemnation of President Trump for taking this operation, the directive that he gave pertaining to the capturing of Maduro. And I want to point that out, and I know the side subject, Alex, but how horrendous the city of New York City that was attacked by Islamist terrorists in 2001 lit the city at the direction of the governor in green in honor of Islam here just in the past few days.
Yeah, and the irony too that we're going after communists in Latin America while our own biggest city is being taken over by a communist, an Islamo-Marxist, who by the way, his tenant director just said recently we're going to have to rethink our relationship with private property, and this is very, very alarming. And I think really people aren't seeing the connections, but this is all related, right? There is an international movement. And Donald Trump was warned about this back in 2017 by the Director of Policy and Planning on the National Security Council, Rich Higgins. He told Trump there is an international alliance now of communists and jihadists and socialists and others, globalists. And their goal, he said, was to destroy the United States of America, not just as a nation, but even as an ideal. And I think what we're seeing with Mamdani in New York and what we're seeing in Venezuela, these are both part of exactly what Rich Higgins described in that memo.
We have Kathy calling next. Kathy, you're on the air.
Yeah, I was just kind of wondering, when was the last time we actually declared war? Like, Korea was a police action, and I don't remember what they called Vietnam, but was World War II the actual official last time we declared war?
Yes, it was. Yep, World War II was the last time the U.S. Congress declared war, and that's very unfortunate. And both parties have been guilty of this. They passed the War Powers Resolution, which allowed them to at least statutorily engage in these wars without permission from Congress. They passed the authorization for the use of military force to kick off the global war on terror. But I, for one, at least me personally, I would like to see a return to the constitutional principle that only Congress declares war, and then the president leads the armed forces, but does not have the authority to unilaterally launch military campaigns without Congress.
Kathy, thank you for the call. Jim in Hermiston, Oregon, you're on the air.
Hi, Jim. Thank you. And Alex, thank you for your insight on this situation. I was just wondering if you can give me your take on several hours after the incident. Protests were taking place all over the country, and all these protesters, or most of them, had these professional-made signs and banners marching in the streets. And I've seen this on the internet. This question also. Do you have any idea how these people got these things together so quickly? Okay. Do you think maybe there was some kind of a leak out of the White House to somebody there?
Thank you, Jim. Alex.
I think that's a possibility, but really what we have now in the United States is a protest industrial complex. It is very, very well funded. They have people on the payroll who go out and protest for money. All this has been documented over and over and over again. And they're very professional now, right? They can print up signs very, very quickly. They've got the architecture, the infrastructure in place so that when a rent-a-mob is needed somewhere, they can make it happen real quick, and my guess is that's probably what happened. The word went out. And if you follow the Communist Party propaganda outlets, they're very, very vocal about this. Get out in the streets, and you got to be protesting. You got to take signs. And so there are all these different communist and socialist groups in America that are extremely well funded that specialize in having these protests pop up when they're needed. And I think that's probably what's going on.
Thank you for your call. Here we're up against a break. Alex Newman, our guest. We'll continue with your calls in our final segment here as well. Friends, we're talking about the Venezuelan president being captured, certainly indicted in courts, appeared in court this morning, pled not guilty, and more to come. We'll be back in just 1 minute. You're listening to Crosstalk on VCY America.
For the Worldview Report, I'm Brandon House. Our website's worldviewtube.com. Well, since 2010, here on our broadcast, we have been warning since 2010 about Iranian missiles in Venezuela. We've been warning about 5,000 Russian-made man-pads. Those are able to be shot from the ground to the air. We've been warning about those circulating around Venezuela. So I'm very happy with the action that President Trump has taken. Folks can argue about it, and they are free to do so. But from a national security standpoint, I think he was right on the mark when he cited the Monroe Doctrine. The idea we're not going to let other countries, and certainly not enemy states, set up in our backyard. Not in Venezuela, not in Cuba, and certainly not on our border in Mexico or Canada. We'll see what happens with Mexico and with Cuba. But again, I think President Trump is trying to secure the country, and I'm all for it. I'm Brandon House.
Alex Newman with us today. His website, libertysentinel.org, and also thenewamerican.com. Let's go right back to the phone lines. Mark is calling from Monroe. Mark, you're on the air.
Yeah, my comment is I'm very skeptical with our justice system. Mm-hmm. If we can't get convictions with domestic enemies, I don't see doing any better with a foreign enemy, especially in New York. You already mentioned Mom Bondi. He's already outspoken about this incident. Mm-hmm. So my question is, do you think our justice system, again, I'm asking for your opinion, do you think it will be undermined by the deep state?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the call. And I mean, to the extent that we still have a justice system, it has absolutely been undermined by the deep state, and you see that so clearly. I mean, I understand the desire to go after criminals like Maduro, a very, very serious criminal, but it's not like we don't have our own fair share of criminals right here in this country who are still walking around free, who've been involved in many of the same exact kinds of crimes that Maduro is being accused of, and we've seen a number of very high-profile indictments tossed out by federal courts, and unfortunately, we have a judiciary that's been out of control for a very long time. I mean, this is not a new phenomenon. They literally created a right to kill your babies, or at least pretended to create a right to kill your babies 50 years ago in the highest court in the United States, the U.S. Supreme Court. So we have a justice system that is absolutely in shambles. Very frequently, it delivers injustice and undermines justice. And so, unfortunately, we have a lot of work to go if this situation can be turned around. And it'll be interesting to see what happens with Maduro. I think it's possible that the justice system could work properly, but there's a lot of people within the justice system who I don't think have justice in mind as their overriding goal.
Yeah, let me just mention the name Kilmar Abrego Garcia and the Maryland man. Okay. Thank you for the call. I appreciate it very much, Mark. Josh is next. Hi, Josh. You're on the air.
Hi. So I know in the past we've seen presidents do similar things, like with Muammar Gaddafi and Osama bin Laden or Saddam Hussein. How is this any different, and why didn't we hear any outcry from the liberal left at that point? Is it just now, Trump did it, so now it's suddenly a bad thing?
Thank you, Josh. Alex?
Yeah, I mean, what happened with Gaddafi, as terrible of a dictator as he was, I think was really inappropriate. I mean, Barack Obama used our military without permission from Congress to really wage war on Libya. And what was especially grotesque about that was that he actually allied with the very people and organizations that we had ostensibly been at war with for the prior decade. The literally Al-Qaeda, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which publicly bragged about how it was an affiliate of Al-Qaeda. Its leaders were talking to the press saying they were Al-Qaeda. So, I mean, that's a very, very good example of the dangers of allowing one man, a president, to do these types of things. Through NATO and through the UN, both claim the authority to send our troops into war without the permission of the U.S. Congress. So I think these are very dangerous, and I'm hoping that we can have a national conversation in light of what just happened about executive power and about the Constitution and about the war powers. I think it's a conversation that's long overdue, but your point is very well taken, right? Previous U.S. presidents have done all kinds of lawless things with our military. Incidentally, Gaddafi was actually an ally in the terror war. So we do need to have, I think, a very serious national conversation about this, especially now that the U.S. is unfortunately declining as a global power. We no longer can do these kinds of things unchallenged like we could even 15, 20 years ago. So it's way past time for a national discussion. What are the biblical implications of this? What are the constitutional implications of this? And what do we as Americans want with what is supposed to be our government?
Yeah. Thank you, Josh. James is next in Tennessee. James, you're on the air.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, they had one caller there who was asked about the judicial system, but I'd like to take it one step further. we had James Comey indicted and Letitia James indicted, and I think Trump had the goods on them, or they would have been indicted. A federal judge dismissed both of those cases, and I don't have any confidence in any of these federal judges to do anything to Maduro. What would happen if he dismisses Maduro the same way he dismissed Letitia James and James Comey case?
Okay. Thank you, James. Skepticism to the judicial system. Alex, you kind of addressed that before.
Yeah, and I don't think that's out of the question. I think that is entirely within the realm of possibility that a judge could look at this and say, wait a minute here, like this indictment is no good, throw it out and send Maduro back home. And, at that point, it would be a tremendous embarrassment, a just utter humiliation of the Trump administration. So we'll have to see what happens. But I don't think that scenario is completely out of the question, especially in light of what we've seen just in the last few months. So.
Yeah. Thank you, James. Jesus is calling from Glendale, Arizona. Jesus, you're on the air.
Good afternoon, Jim. Thank you for taking my call. Mm-hmm. Yes, I agree. What's happening in Venezuela is strategic as well. And also, too, that needs to take place also, I believe, in our country as well, because not only Governor Tim Walz and Mayor Jacob Fry and Ilhan Omar, they should all be arrested for sending our taxpayer dollars to Minnesota, to Somalia to fund terrorism. That should be punishable by death, sir.
Jesus, thank you for your comment here today. Alex, that's another whole topic itself, Somalia, but he brings up that point. We've got leadership in this country in different states and jurisdictions that are not doing any favors to the U.S. and really undermining our constitutional system.
We do, and I would even go a step further. I would say that for several generations now at least, we have had people at the highest levels of government and corporate America who have been willfully engaged in treasonous activities against our country, trying to subvert our constitutional republic, trying to empower our top geopolitical enemies like the Communist Chinese Party and others, the Soviet Union, even the Cubans. And, we have to get a handle on these before we try to police the world, in my opinion. We've got a lot of problems here at home. We've got a lot of people who've perpetrated very serious crimes. And, we need to go back, I think, to a biblical understanding of government. Government is not here to run your life. It's not here to give you free stuff that it took from your neighbor. It's here to punish evil. And as long as the government is not punishing evil consistently, we're going to see the proliferation of evil. As long as government is not restraining evil, we're going to see more and more evil. We've got a lot of it in our country right now, and it's got to be dealt with.
Alex Newman with us today. And Alex, thank you for rearranging your schedule to join us and our Crosstalk listeners today.
Thank you so much for having me, Tim. Always a pleasure.
And friends, remember to be praying for our leaders, those who are in authority. LibertySentinel.org and thenewamerican.com.
You've been listening to Crosstalk via satellite and the internet from VCY America. Views expressed may or may not be those of this station. For a CD of today's program, send a donation of $6 or more to VCY Tape Ministry, 3434 West Kilbourne Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 53208. Or download by RSS or podcast from crosstalkamerica.com. And join us again for Crosstalk.